All right. Good morning, Legacy Bible Church. It's Wednesday. We're here with Sarah, and I'm back. I enjoyed listening to you and Robin last week
It's good.
as I had this big bandage on the side of my face. And so the bandage is removed, and I'm back. And
We're
so
ready to talk.
here we go.
Well, we're going to keep going with our back to the basics. And just a quick recap, the first week we talked about what led Stephen to understanding the New Testament authors, uh, their meaning in their scriptures. And he gave us an amazing testimony of how he was going through the scriptures and what led him to this slow turning on the light of what the New Testament authors really had intended versus what we understand as the corrupted version. Then last week, Robin and I just sat and chatted with you guys about the fact that yes, some of this can seem hard to understand, but we can understand what Paul truly meant, and we can understand the scriptures in the way that they were intended for us to understand. They don't have to be watered down, and we just gave a few examples. And so I encourage you to go back and listen to those two. And today I'm excited because our third part in this series of Back to the Basics is I want to ask you, Stephen, to tell us why Legacy Bible Church? How did that get started? Why did you choose that name? Take us on that journey of why we are here as Legacy Bible Church.
Yeah, that is, as is so often the case, that is a not a simple answer. It's part of a journey, and the human experiences are very multifaceted,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so very difficult to give just a linear explanation of how it happened because there's lots of tentacles at work. But let me try to broach it, and please bust in with
Questions?
what about this or
Okay.
another question. Yeah.
Okay.
Because as I'm thinking about this, it may start to wander off of the what we want to talk
Okay.
about here today. Why Legacy Bible Church? How did it get started? Why do we do what we do
Mm-hmm.
at Legacy Bible Church?
What made you choose the name? Kind of that journey.
Yeah, well, why don't we start there?
Okay.
Legacy Bible Church, and that's a good place to start because a lot of people kind of misunderstand it. What does legacy mean? Why do you call it that? Legacy, the whole purpose is to go back to the apostles. It's the legacy of the apostles. It's when we say legacy and Legacy Bible Church, we're not saying legacy in terms of some recent tradition. For instance, the first church tradition that Robert and I attended uh, had a change in their local tradition, and a big part of the church broke away because they didn't want that change in the local tradition. And they broke away and called themselves Legacy,
Mm-hmm.
la la la. In other words,
Mm-hmm.
we're keeping the legacy that you broke away from. And legacy can sometimes be viewed in a contemporary context, like we're a legacy of something here in this age, in this century, in
Well,
this
there's
decade.
a few churches just around me that have the name Legacy in it, and I know when they were trying to get their name, one church in particular I'm thinking of, it was because their whole drive towards this new name was we're building a legacy for starting now for our
Oh,
children
that's a
and go
future,
a
or
few
they're the legacy
building
then.
it, yeah.
Yeah, they're
So
saying we are the
mhm.
legacy for the future.
And honestly, I mean, in all of this time, I don't even know if I've asked you about the name because I'm sitting here listening to you, understanding that you're talking about the legacy that the New
Mhm.
Testament authors
They are
left.
the
Okay,
legacy.
okay.
Yeah. So when we call ourselves Legacy Bible Church, our name, the purpose and meaning for legacy has nothing to do with us other than we are the teaching that we do at Legacy Bible Church is a direct product of the legacy of the apostles themselves.
Hmm.
And by the apostles themselves, I mean the authors of the New Testament documents, the men that wrote the New Testament documents created the legacy for which we call ourselves Legacy Bible Church. And that ties into the ministry of Legacy Bible Church, and that we believe, and this is what we teach week after week after week. It's a very consistent message that during the first centuries of the church, back, the church was founded in AD 33 with the cross and the resurrection. And it was not very long after that what I'll call here a Judaized tradition of syncretizing Moses with Jesus began to evolve very early at the Church at Jerusalem. And that's the tradition that would end up, that's the progenitor of the tradition that would end up taking hold at Rome and would end up spreading through the entire Roman Empire and would become known as Catholic Orthodoxy. All was parented by this other, what Paul called the other euangelion that evolved very early at Jerusalem. So what we teach at Legacy Bible Church is to go back to that original, what Irenaeus called, and I've mentioned this several times, Irenaeus called the ancient tradition of the apostles. It's the first, not just the first tradition, but the tradition that was established with the cross and the empty grave at the very beginning. Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century was looking back at that over the Catholic Orthodox tradition that was seated at Rome, all the way back to the beginning of the church. He called it the ancient tradition of the apostles. And at that time, he's calling it the ancient tradition because it's going back to the beginning. So that's why we call ourselves Legacy Bible Church, is to go back to the ancient tradition of the apostles. What did they mean and what did they believe? And of course, as we teach, what you believe is always going to translate into what you practice, how you walk out your faith practice, how you worship God is going to come out of the doctrine that you hold to about the gospel. So Legacy Bible Church is very explicitly passing over 18 centuries of Catholic Orthodoxy and going back to the ancient tradition of the apostles, the legacy they created in those first years at the beginning. That's what we teach, that's what we practice, and that's why we call ourselves Legacy Bible Church.
And how did you even get started?
Well, that would be the good lead into the rest of the question then. Yeah. Well, it ties into what we talked about the first week on how did I come to believe and understand the gospel the way that I do. And you have to go back and listen to the first session 2 weeks ago to hear that story. But it was out of that, I'll just call it the fog lifting on what is the fullness of understanding of what Paul's writing in the book of Romans. As that fog lifted, and I began to see the fullness, and really for the first time, this is in 2016, 11 years into my faith walk, for the very first time I'm getting a fullness of the understanding of what Paul's writing about, that he's not writing about the initial redemption of a believer when the Father gives faith. Paul's emphasis, almost his entire emphasis in writing, is about after the Father gives faith and the children of God, then what then? How do you walk out the faith? And for Paul, walking out the faith is one thing. And his teaching is pervasive on this through all of his letters. And when you see this hermeneutic that Paul was writing about teaching, you can go read it in the Gospels and see that this is the same thing that Jesus is teaching about in the Gospels. And so as the fog lifted on that, and that process that I talked about 2 weeks ago.
Were you still going to a church?
I definitely was still going to a church. I had spent my first 10 years in a non-charismatic church from about 2004 to 2014. And then from 2014 to this fog lifting in 2016, I was attending a charismatic church. It was a Pentecostal church.
And going to seminary.
And going to a conservative evangelical seminary, which I'll tell you is Dallas Theological Seminary. I won't mention the name of the churches. That doesn't really matter. But yeah, at that time I was attending a charismatic church. It was from the Assemblies of God tradition. And as this fog is lifting, and as I'm describing here, the catharsis that I was going through would have happened at the non-charismatic church. The fact that I was attending a charismatic church at the time is incidental. I would have had the same experience at the non-charismatic church.
I'm following.
But what I came to understand is that as I'm always engaging dialogue with my pastors, my church leadership, is that there really wasn't any interest in discussing what I was coming into an understanding of that was really challenging the very core of this, the tradition of the Assemblies of God, if you will. But like I said, it would equally challenge the core of the church that I'd been to previously.
So.
Well, not necessarily, in a different way, but would have been very challenging to the other. You know, obviously, the Assemblies of God have speaking in tongues, albeit I will say categorically a very corrupted understanding, a very distorted understanding of what speaking in tongues is. And of course, my first non-charismatic church had no speaking in tongues. They wouldn't even talk about it. It was kind of one of those taboo, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. We just don't talk about it. We don't teach it, and we just don't do that here. I happened to be at a charismatic church when I came into this understanding. And so as I was coming into this understanding and finding no interest on the part of church leadership in having a discussion about the understanding that I was coming into, and in fact, almost a resistance to it. And the reason for the resistance is that the Pentecostal tradition believes in, wrongly, very wrongly, believes that a human being can be sanctified and holy in the flesh.
By works.
And just by, ostensibly, they would say, because of the working of the Holy Spirit, that there's the ability, human ability, to walk in holiness and sanctification in this life. So the understanding I was coming into, which is, I think, once the fog lifts, very explicit with Paul's teachings. Just read Romans chapter 7 if you want maybe his best explanation of the continuing utter sinfulness of spirit regenerated children of God in this life, in this flesh, regardless of any efforts on our part. We just have a continuing utter sinfulness that is still in need of daily sanctification, which we get in spiritually spoken worship. That's the realm of entering into the holiness, perfection, sanctification of God, in Jesus. And the idea of a Christian being utterly sinful still in the flesh, in this life, in this age, walking with in our mind, our thinking, is really anathema to a lot of church tradition. It would be in a different way, even anathema in the non-charismatic church I went to, because they still held to the objective of a good Christian is to abide by the Ten Commandments, and which is a good guideline to use. We teach about that often. The Ten Commandments do reflect the righteousness of God, and we should accept the Ten Commandments and as a good guideline for living this life. But the main thing is, don't ever think, and this was very consistent with Paul, don't ever think that out of trying to keep the Ten Commandments, that either we're successful in doing it, because we can't do it, or that by trying to keep the Ten Commandments, we're keeping God happy, because that's not what's going to. us striving partially successfully to keep the Ten Commandments is not God's goal for us. God's goal for us is, just like Jesus said, be perfect as my Father in heaven is perfect. That's God's goal for us. And in this age, that's only possible in that punctiliar realm when we are worshiping the Father in spirit and in truth. That's where we achieve the reality of what when Jesus said, be perfect as my Father in heaven is perfect. That's where that becomes a reality, is in that punctiliar realm. So, okay. To the question. That's the preface there. Otherwise,
all of this is lifting, the old tradition is
hard
lifting,
to understand.
And you're starting to understand truly what the New Testament authors are pointing to. Okay.
Yeah, and as I'm concurrently having conversation in my church environment with this understanding and seeing that there's no interest in even having the conversation, it I would say fairly quickly became apparent that if I'm going to walk in this, if I'm going to pursue this, it's not going to be amidst an established, entrenched tradition, which I found that with the non-charismatic church when Robin and I finally made the decision that it was time to leave that and investigate the possibility of another tradition. Finding the same thing in the charismatic tradition, entrenched, not interested in even having the discussion. It's that our tradition has answered all the questions. This is what we believe, and we're just not interested in going there. So it became apparent that if I'm going to pursue this understanding of the fullness of the gospel, that it wasn't going to be inside of an existing church tradition. I was going to have to step outside of that. Mm-hmm. And so that really became the genesis, if you will, almost concurrent with that fog lifting and coming to the realization that we're not going to have that discussion inside of an existing Christian Catholic Orthodox. When I say Catholic Orthodox, I'm talking about traditions of the church broadly mm-hmm. speaking that evolved out of that early Catholic Orthodoxy, so-called Catholic Orthodoxy. That's what they called themselves. So the realization set in fairly quickly. This is back in late 2016. That to pursue this, I'm going to have to leave this church tradition, and in fact, there isn't a church tradition that I was aware of that was going to be open to mm-hmm. this, pursuing this, having this discussion, and it just became kind of obvious, if you will, in my mind and several others with Robin, and we had another couple that we were walking with in this, that we're just going to have to, as an act of faith, just begin a ministry that could teach this understanding of the gospel and begin to walk in this gospel and to pursue this gospel, and thus Legacy Bible Church.
So I'm trying to think, would you have, if the church tradition that you were in had wanted to talk and wanted to converse about it, maybe given you an opportunity to teach or to talk, or would you have considered staying?
I think so.
And so when you pulled
mm-hmm.
yourself out and you and Robin decided, did y'all immediately decide that you wanted to get online and teach? Did you have a heart?
We didn't really know at the time. We made the decision, like I said, with this it was two couples, Robin and I and another couple, that decided that the time was right and that it was appropriate, and really not just appropriate, but really the only way to pursue and walk in this understanding that we had been given of the fullness of the gospel was going to be to establish a ministry and just begin teaching it.
Okay.
And so we thought it might be some kind of a church community that started. So we rented a building, and we wanted to, because of the whole internet world, we wanted to make sure that we could reach as large and as broad an audience as possible. We said, well, this needs to be a teaching that has a local fellowship community, just like any other church, opportunity for fellowship locally. But we wanted this teaching to reach across the globe to anybody that could access it through the internet. And so we did both. We established it with local community and teaching Sunday morning. We still do on Sunday morning, and reaching globally through internet broadcast. And that was from the very beginning our objective.
To minister, as just that was your vision for Legacy Bible Church. Okay, so
and in terms of mission statement, our mission, if you want to call it mission and vision for Legacy Bible Church, is to provide the Bible teaching to support home groups. And we're hoping that eventually, this is our hope, what God wants to do, God will do, but our hope and what rests strongly, heavy in our heart is that the teaching that we do at Legacy Bible Church will be the basis for teaching ministry, for Bible teaching ministry, for home groups, wherever they might want to assemble.
I love that. That's kind of more how the beginning church, just in homes, like not these big buildings.
And that's how they did it. Yeah.
It's kind of, that's even more, I like that. I like that idea. It kind of even goes with the idea of it being a legacy from the ancient apostles. What is it? I wrote it down. Ancient tradition of the apostles.
Yes.
To even do a home type thing instead of having this big, huge church with, walls and lights and sounds and all that. Because if you're stepping away from the whole mainstream church tradition, then you kind of have to step away from all of that too. So it's not really what
You do. One of the things that I say from time to time, and I guess it would be important to say here, is that as you listen to the teaching at Legacy Bible Church, often, maybe most often, maybe even without exception, the initial tendency is going to be to hang on to the tradition, the things that you've believed and loved, and maybe append onto it. Say, well, there are certain things I'm hearing at Legacy Bible Church that I like, that I'll try and attach on to what I think and believe. And that wasn't the case with Paul. With Paul, he had this word, is a Greek word called alatrios. It's an adjective that means a different kind of. He used it a couple of times in Romans, and it would be worth you going and looking at, because it'll help you see where I'm coming from on
alatrios?
This. Alatrios.
And you said it means?
It means another kind of. And in terms of another kind of, another class, and entirely almost a different DNA, another kind of DNA. It's that much of a different kind of. And he used it 2 times in Romans. That really gives clarity to what he was talking about, that you can't merge the two. They're distinctly different, so that it's either this or that, but there's no bringing them together. Use it at the beginning of chapter 14 when he's talking about weak faith, and he makes a comment almost to a second person Jewish interlocutor that he's having this conversation with as he writes. And he says, "Who are you, O man, to," and he's actually reflecting back on the letter from James, because it's very similar to some of the language that James used in his letters, and Paul did that in his writing. Paul was very often engaging with the letter from James, and he would say, "Who are you, O man, to judge a different kind of servant?" And often, if you look at that at the beginning of chapter 14 in your English version, it'll probably say something along the lines of, "Who are you, O man, to judge another man's servant?" That is not what Paul wrote. That is not what Paul meant. He wrote very specifically, very literally, who are you, O man, to judge another kind of servant? And another kind of means distinctly comparing to the two traditions, the Judaized tradition that he called the other euangelion, there at the beginning of Galatians, and then the gospel of Christ, the good message of Christ, the euangelion of Christ that he taught and practiced and walked in. Mm-hmm. And so when he talks about another kind of servant, he's distinguishing that these are two types of service of worship to God. They are two distinctly different kinds of service of worship. He did the same thing at the end of chapter 15, and so one of the earliest indications that we can get that there's something different going on at Rome that would end up evolving into so-called Catholic Orthodoxy. He writes at the end of chapter 15 of Romans that he wants to go to Rome, and he wants to have fellowship briefly there on his way to Spain. And he makes a comment there. He says that it's not his intention to build upon, using alatrios again, another kind of foundation. He's acknowledging that the other euangelion has already become seated at Rome. And so as he's writing this letter to the Romans saying, I'm coming to Rome, I want to have fellowship with you, and on my way to Spain, I'm not going to stay there. It'll pass through. I'll get some refreshing. We can fellowship on my way to Spain. He acknowledges that it's not his intention to come there and build upon another kind of foundation. And again, if you look at the end of chapter 15, you'll see that often gets translated as another man's foundation. That's not what Paul wrote, but translators write that because they don't have the conception of the fullness of what Paul's talking about. Paul is always engaging with this whole idea that there's this other gospel that has crept into the scene and is taking hold. And very often in his letters, that's the issue he's engaging with. So when he talks at Rome about using alatrios, another kind of foundation, he's talking about a gospel tradition that is genetically different than the gospel he teaches, and he calls it another kind of foundation. So bring us back to the Legacy Bible Church ministry. When people listen to it, a lot of what we say and teach might sound attractive, interesting. I haven't heard that before. And there often is a tendency to say, well, I'll kind of take that and just attach it to what I know and love. And
does not work.
You'll find over time that just doesn't work, because these are two, what we teach at Legacy Bible Church is so restorative back to the original meaning and intent of the authors of the New Testament that there is really no reconciling it with the so-called Catholic Orthodox traditions. It goes back beyond that to that original tradition that sparked at Jerusalem with the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
So I want to say something to that, which we are going to, in one of the topics in this series, we'll be talking about reconciling what we teach versus the mainstream. So we will get to that because it's very important to understand that it will never reconcile. But what I love about Legacy Bible Church is that you didn't just come away from a church and go try to do exactly what you're talking about, build on another foundation already that's already there by doing the same 3 songs, lights, camera, action, selling. I sometimes think the mainstream church is working so hard to sell Jesus. It's the advertisement, the lights, the glamour, all of it. And here we are saying that means nothing. That has nothing to do with the scriptures. And we're just going to give you the meat and potatoes every single time. We're not going to fancy it up. We're not going to, it's going to be the same seasoning, the same thing every time.
Every week.
But it's yummy and it's so good, and it's every time you're craving it, it's so good. I love that you didn't try to just pick up that tradition and put this spin on it. No, you've actually taken apart it all, found out what is the basic, what is the basis of this, what is the truth, and we're going to start there and stay there and not go anywhere else. And I love that. And I know if you listen, even you can listen to many churches online and many teachings online, because I used to, and they still have that same flair where you start with the music and you have all the intro, and we don't have the 3 worship songs, and we don't have all that. We just have, like Stephen always says, our meat and our potatoes, and we go after that the same time, the same thing every week, breaking down the scriptures, drawing the real meaning out, teaching what the authors wanted us to know and understand. And so when you do listen to Legacy Bible Church, and you do listen to this ministry and the teaching, it is different. And sometimes, just as Stal Ross is very wooden, I think that sometimes you might listen and think, that's not as glamorous as some other preachers that have their jokes in there, and they, and you're right. But I'll tell you what, I used to listen to many teachings. I mean, probably 7 or 8 a week on top of going to a church. But I love, like, there's something safe and true. It's always going to mean the same thing. I never walk away thinking, well, how does that fit to last week? And how am I going to connect the dots? And you said that last week, but you didn't say that this week. And that doesn't make sense. And, never, ever. So I just encourage people. That's why one of the basics is to hear Stephen's heart, hear my heart, hear Robin's heart on why we do what we do. And I think that this provided a good overview of why Legacy Bible Church, and the name, and how you got started, that you were wanting this. You were wanting to let the New Testament authors teach what they meant to teach, and so you had to just kind of break away and do that.
And one of the reasons that I believe that this is the providence of God, this is the leading of God, this is the calling of God, is because not only did I never have any concept or idea of ever starting a teaching ministry, a church movement, if you will, restorative church movement. The idea never crossed my mind, but I would go so far as to say that if you had asked me prior to 2016 about the idea of doing some kind of a teaching ministry, anything of the sort of what we're doing today, it would have been no. Not just no, but heck no.
We're not doing that.
That wasn't, it wasn't just that wasn't on the horizon, but I would have been repulsed by that.
Yeah.
And as this understanding of the gospel became real and apparent to me, as that fog lifted, there was just this overwhelming desire on my heart to, this is for the church. This is not just for Steve Goodall, or just for Steve and Robin, or just for a select small group. This is a teaching for the entire church.
For anybody that will listen, this is for...
If you have faith to believe in Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of God and Savior, this teaching is for you. This is for the church. And it was new. I would have never had that desire, but suddenly that desire was almost irresistible.
And now, and even still, you love to come and teach on Sunday mornings.
Love it.
Robin likes to get up there, and I know sometimes Robin and I feel a little self-conscious, and maybe you do too, but we do feel self-conscious, but I love sitting down on Wednesdays and talking. I know Stephen and Robin love to broadcast on Sunday mornings. And so that is a sure sign of God reordering and reworking our minds.
It is, yeah.
Because you didn't come up with it. You didn't just roll over one day and say, I know what I'll do.
Oh my gosh.
I will start teaching people on the internet.
Yeah, that would have, no, that was like, no, I would rather go live my life on the golf course than think of doing this.
Sunday mornings on a golf course instead of in front of the screen. I get that.
We love the church.
Yes.
And I say that broadly speaking. If you have faith to believe in Jesus, you're the church. We love the church, and our burning heart and desire is that you would hear this teaching and become worshipers of the Father through the Son Jesus Christ by the working of the Spirit, the kind of worship that the Father wants, the kind of worship that Jesus talked about when he said the Father desires to have the true worshipers worshiping him in spirit and in truth. This is the worship that Jesus was talking about. And our burning desire is that you would hear this teaching and that you would join us in that spiritual fellowship with the Father through the Son, Jesus Christ.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah.
Any questions, comments, email? And I can't wait we might be back next week with you. Maybe not. If not, I will, I'll either continue my back to the basics or maybe say something else, but I'll be back.
Well, I'll just tell you, my mother's having a 90th birthday, and I'm on my way to see my mother and celebrate her 90th birthday with her.
So deal.
I hope if I'm not back here next Wednesday, we get to hear Sarah.
Yes,
I love hearing Sarah.
We love the church. We love to do this. So thank you. And we will see y'all next week.
We'll see you then.